TDC leaders, Ketchrick here. Listen, I hope you guys are having an amazing week. It's good to be back in the homes this week. I hope last week was good for you. Hope your spring break was awesome, and hope you had a great time. So tonight we actually have a purpose night, but this week is going to look a little different than it has in the past. We've done this actually a couple times, but instead of doing purpose night at TDC, obviously you're in home, so you guys are going to be hearing, just like before, you've heard from Andy, and you've heard from Michael Young. This time you're actually going to hear from our friend Sarah Long, and she's going to actually walk through some things with you tonight over video that I think will be very helpful for you in this time. But before we jump into that, a couple things that I want you guys to know about that we do here around here is the mission, vision, and values that we started a couple weeks ago in the rules. So we're going to jump into that. So when it pops up on the screen, you know what to do. Pause it, and we'll go on to the next thing. When the next thing comes up, pause it. And then once we get through the rules, then we will jump into hearing from Sarah. So let's head to the mission statement now. Now let's listen to the vision statement. Now, one of the things that we haven't done in a while, or that we just started doing recently, is the values. And so we'll go over those. If someone wants to read those out loud, feel free to pause it, have someone read the 3 values, and then we'll move on to the rules. Here are the rules. All right, now that you guys have gone over the rules, the mission, vision, and values, we are going to, before jumping in with Sarah, we're actually going to do worship time. So if you have not done worship yet, which you probably haven't, have someone cue up some music for this time. Make sure you have your journals and your pens. And if someone will pray before we jump into the worship time, that would be awesome. And so let's jump in and do that now. All right, now that we've done all the things for tonight, yes, tonight is that purpose night that we were talking about earlier. You are going to hear now from Sarah Long as she gets to bring us some time to share with us her crazy, awesome wisdom. One thing I want to say to you, Sarah, is I love when you're at TDC on a Wednesday night. I love when you speak up and you share the things that are on your heart. And we're just so grateful that you're here. I'm just so grateful for how gifted so many of our mentors are. And I love it when you guys as students and mentors get to see other mentors and what they get to do on a daily basis and just how gifted they are. So without further ado, here is your friend and our friend, Sarah Long.
Hey TDC, my name is Sarah. For some of you who don't know me, hello. I'm really excited to talk to you guys tonight for Purpose Night about something that I would say is near and dear to my heart, but also something that I could geek out on for probably hours and hours, which I'm not going to do that tonight. So we'll keep it short and sweet. Well, as short as possible. So we're going to go ahead and jump into it. So I know you guys had an opportunity to do some journaling and some quiet time before this. So if you don't already have your journals or you put your journals back, if you could grab them, you'll need them for what we're going to talk about tonight. You'll also need either a pen or a pencil. So you don't already have that, grab that. If you do, then let's get started. So some of you know this, some of you don't. I am a therapist, which is a really fancy term for I talk to people about things that they're dealing with, problems that they have, goals that they want to meet, all those kind of things. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is this idea called CBT, which is a 3-letter acronym for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, which is a mouthful to say, which is why we shortened it to CBT, but it's also 3 pretty big words. So to simplify it, really what CBT is kind of this idea of it's a theory of how our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions are all interconnected and how each one kind of influences the other. So we're going to spend a little time tonight talking about that and kind of talking about one specific trick slash kind of a, not necessarily a theory, but just kind of a example of something that you could use with CBT. So that is why you need your journal. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into it. So what I'm gonna introduce to you tonight and talk about tonight is this thing called the cognitive triangle, which is a really, really fancy way of saying an idea of how we think, how we feel, and how we behave or how we act. So you'll hear a lot tonight the words thoughts, the words feelings, and the word action. You can't see this because I'm doing it below the screen, but I'm literally making a triangle with my hands. So let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is thoughts. So throughout this video, I'm going to tell you to pause the video and kind of have a group discussion. So this is the first pause. The question I want you guys to ponder or talk about or think through is, if you had to explain to someone what thoughts are, how would you explain that? So what are thoughts? So pause the video right now and answer the question of what are thoughts. Okay, now what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your journal and your pen or pencil, doesn't matter which, and I want you to think about thoughts. So if you had to draw what thoughts are, what would you draw? It doesn't have to be this huge elaborate picture. It doesn't have to be anything beyond what image, what picture comes to mind comes to mind to you when you hear the word thoughts. So you're gonna pause this video again and take a little bit of a longer time to draw that out. Feel free to share the drawings with your family group if you want to. There's absolutely no pressure to share any of this with anybody, but know that opportunity is there if you would like it. So pause the video and draw what comes to mind when you think of the word thoughts. Okay. A big thing with thoughts is kind of this idea, and probably a lot of you have already heard this, but this idea of helpful thoughts versus unhelpful thoughts. So one of the ways that I like to describe it, and it's kind of weird, so go with me for a second, is this idea that our brains are kind of like trash sorters, which I'm not saying that our brains are trash, our brains are beautiful, but they kind of sort through things. So they sort through good thoughts and not good thoughts, or helpful thoughts and not helpful thoughts. Well, sometimes our trash sorter, or that part of our brain, has a hard time distinguishing between what is a helpful thought that's worth keeping and what is an unhelpful thought that we need to get rid of. And so anxiety is a good example. When we have anxiety or we're feeling anxious, sometimes our brain thinks, oh, this is a really helpful thought, I need to keep it. So we think about it and we think about it and we think about it, when in reality, that's actually not a helpful thought. So like a lot of what if questions. So you guys could probably spend the next however long is left in family group talking about all the what if scenarios or all the what if thoughts that you've had in your head. But what if thoughts can sometimes be unhelpful thoughts. And so it's this idea of figuring out what is a helpful thought that's worth keeping and what is an unhelpful thought that needs to go away, for lack of a better phrase. A key thing with what if thoughts, and I think a really helpful thing that I actually had another therapist friend tell me this, is this idea of thought reversal. And that's a really fancy way of saying taking that what if thought and flipping it on its head. So it's this idea of like, well, what if I do this thing and it ends poorly? Or what if I, try to take my permit test and I fail my permit test? It's like, okay, well, we're gonna take that thought and we're gonna reverse it. We're gonna flip it on its head. And it's like, well, what if you take the permit test and you pass? What if what you think is gonna happen does not happen? So that's that idea of thought reversal that can be really helpful with the idea of thoughts. So if any thoughts come up with this or any discussion comes from this, feel free to pause the video now and have that discussion. But if not, we'll move on to feelings, which is probably my personal favorite, which probably a lot of you already know that. So feelings, they are emotions. They're what we feel, all those kind of things. So if you had to explain the idea or the concept of feelings or emotions to someone else who, let's say, hasn't ever heard that word before or anything like that. How would you explain the idea or concept of emotion? So pause the video and talk about that. How do you explain emotions to someone? All right, grab your journals again because we're doing it again. And that same question that we had with thoughts, we're now going to overlay on feelings. So when you hear the word feelings or emotions, we're going to kind of use those two words interchangeable. So if I say feelings, we also mean emotions and vice versa. So when you hear the word feelings or emotions, what comes to mind? What picture comes to mind? There's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You don't have to be this gifted artist or anything like that. But what picture or image or maybe even words comes to mind when you think of and hear the word emotions or feelings? So pause the video, take some time and do that, and then share if you feel like it. Okay, sorry, I did a little dance, and so that was weird. Anyways, an interesting thing about feelings that are different than thoughts is feelings are directly influenced by thought. So because feelings are directly influenced by thought, a key thing about feelings is that we cannot change them. And what I mean by that is if we're feeling sad, we can't just be like, I am no longer sad, I am happy. That doesn't really work. I think a good example of that we've probably all experienced in different ways is, let's say we're feeling anxious about something and someone meaning it in a very kind way says, oh, well, just don't worry about that. Or, oh, there's no need to be anxious about that. It's like, well, that's not how that works. Just because you tell me not to be anxious about something doesn't mean that I'm magically not going to be anxious about it. So while we cannot change our feelings, our thoughts influence our feelings. So because our thoughts influence our feelings, that means that if we think something differently, it might lead to our feelings feeling different. So that's how we kind of can change our emotion. We can't change our emotion on their own or by themselves, but if we change the way we're thinking, so maybe going from an unhelpful thought to a helpful thought, might also lead from an unhelpful emotion to a helpful emotion, or a unhelpful feeling to a helpful feeling. So that's a crash course, very fast, on emotions. Pause the video if you have any carryover conversation discussion that you want to talk around emotions, or any examples that you have of like, oh my gosh, yes, this one time I was feeling really anxious about this test and someone said, just don't feel sad about it, or don't feel anxious about it. And then it maybe made you feel more anxious, or maybe made you feel a different emotion. So if there's any discussion around that, feel free to pause the video and talk about it now. Okay, our last part of the triangle is this idea called actions. And so I'm not even gonna ask this question, I'm gonna do what I've been doing and ask you this question. If someone comes up to you and asks you the question of what are actions or what are behaviors, those are two words that we're gonna use kind of together. How would you explain action, or how would you explain behavior to someone? So pause the video and take some time to discuss how would you describe actions or behaviors to someone who maybe hasn't heard it. Perfect. Okay, grab your journals again if you don't already have them. And now what you're gonna do is when you hear the word actions or behaviors, I want you to draw what comes to mind with those two things. So action or behavior, what image, picture comes to mind? Pause the video, take as much time as you need to draw that out, and feel free to share it with your family group if you feel led to. Okay, we've talked about thoughts, we've talked about feelings, and we've talked about action. Probably feels a little bit like drinking from a fire hose because I quickly went through these. But now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a little bit of time and we're gonna kind of put them all together. So if you see or realize, when we put them all together, it literally makes a triangle with our thoughts at the top, then our behaviors, that's not right. Let's try that again. Thoughts at the top, then our feelings, and then our actions. So when we think of the triangle like that, our thoughts lead to our feelings, which lead to our action. And so if you think about it from that lens, if you have an unhelpful thought, like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail this test that I have to take. Well, if that's an unhelpful thought of I'm gonna fail this test no matter what I do, then that probably is gonna lead to some unhelpful feelings like, maybe some anxiety, maybe some sadness, maybe a little frustration or a little anger that we can't quite get these concepts, whatever. Those emotions, those feelings are individualized to each person. So one person might feel one thing while another person might feel another. But that unhelpful thought of, I'm never going to pass this test, leads to an unhelpful feeling, which then leads to an unhelpful action. And maybe the unhelpful action is, well, why bother studying? If I'm going to fail the test anyways, there's no point in studying. So I'm not going to take the time to study. So that's how those thoughts, feelings, and actions are all connected in that cognitive triangle. So if we take the thought and we take that unhelpful thought of, why bother, I'm not going to pass this test, and we change it to, I think I can pass this test. Will it take a little hard work? Sure, but I think I can pass it, or I know I can pass it. That becomes a helpful thought, which then leads to a helpful emotion, which maybe instead of feeling anxious, we're feeling hopeful. Or instead of feeling sad, we're feeling motivation to study. Maybe if we're feeling angry, that's also motivation of like, no, I'm going to study and I'm going to prove these people wrong, whatever. So then that helpful emotion leads to a helpful action, which is studying or actually doing well on the test. So that's how when we have a helpful thought, how that leads to a helpful emotion, which then leads to a helpful action. So that's what the cognitive triangle is. And so it's this idea, when we can capture it in our thoughts, that is the most helpful way to rewire the emotion and rewire the action. Easier said than done, I know. So a lot of it involves these big things called coping skills, which are really helpful for our actions. And so part of what I want you to do tonight after we're done with this video is I have a list of questions that either your small group leaders will have or will pop up on the screen, not totally sure. But you'll have an opportunity to go through a bunch of these questions. And one of the questions is, are there any helpful coping skills or coping strategies for you that can be really useful when you have an unhelpful thought or a negative thought or anything like that, or a negative emotion, unhelpful emotion, whatever it is. So it's really this idea of recognizing that all three of those things are interconnected and what do we do with that? So that was a lot. So I'm going to turn it over to your small group leaders and you're going to have an opportunity to just kind of chat through this. If you have any questions, something doesn't make sense, anything like that, feel free to ask your small group leaders or your mentors. And if they can't answer the question, they have my number and I will gladly answer the question for you. But you can do this one of two ways. You can kind of split up with like mentor, mentee, or just kind of the girls together, guys together, or if it's a small enough crew, all of you together, doesn't matter to me. But take some time and kind of process what you just heard. If you have any questions, like I said, ask them. I'll have some questions for all of you guys to ask together to maybe prompt more questions or to prompt like deeper conversation. But yeah, that's the cognitive triangle, that our thoughts impact our feelings, which impact our actions. And what do we do with that? How are they interconnected? How can we better recognize that they're interconnected? So that's it. Like I said, I could talk for hours about this and I'm going to stop because it's time. But enjoy small group discussion. And yeah, I hope it's fruitful. And bummed that I can't be with you guys tonight, but I will be back soon.